begins not with victory, but with silence, the kind that follows a slaughter when even the birds refuse to return. And Brenia understands in that silence that her world has ended. Hours ago, she was queen priestess wife of a king who believed the gods still watched over his people, but now she kneels in frozen mud with blood drying on her skin that does not belong to her, surrounded by hundreds of women who stare straight ahead because looking anywhere else invites pain. Roman soldiers move among them with practiced calm, not as men in battle, but as officials performing a routine they have perfected across continents, separating bodies by age, strength, and beauty, as if sorting livestock. And Brenia realizes with a cold certainty that this moment has happened before and will happen again. She does not cry when she sees her husband as head raised on a spear, because grief is a luxury she can no longer afford. Belief in mercy died with him, replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. Fear presses in from every side, not only of death, but of survival under Roman rules. Rules whispered among captives as warnings about tents, officers, and nights that never end. And yet beneath that fear grows a different emotion. One Rome has always underestimated: calculation. Brenia remembers the old teachings, the hidden laws of her people, the belief that power is not only held by those with swords, but by those who guard knowledge, and she understands. She is now the last living vessel of that knowledge. When the Roman commander watches her, not with hunger but with interest, she recognizes greed in its purest form, a desire not just to conquer land, but to possess meaning, treasure, legitimacy, and control. She allows herself to be taken because resistance would end her story here, and endings are a privilege of the defeated. Inside the commander's tent, she sees the true face of empire, carpets and maps resting on the bones of burned villages, and she feels shock not at Roman cruelty, but at its organization, how carefully violence has been shaped into policy. When he speaks, he lists her titles as if reading inventory, stripping them of reverence, and challenges her unspoken belief that queens are sacred even in defeat. Brenia answers with silence, because silence unsettles men who expect begging, and in that pause she feels curiosity awaken in him, a crack in the armor of certainty Rome wears so proudly. She understands then that survival will not come from strength or purity, but from navigating the system designed to erase her, bending it without letting it know it has been bent. As the tent flaps close behind her, she knows she has crossed into a space history rarely records, where women are transformed into symbols, currency, and warnings, and the choice before her is unbearable: submit and vanish, or play a game against an empire that has never imagined a captive queen could still be dangerous. The night deepens, torches flicker, and Brenia begins to plan, knowing that whatever comes next will demand she sacrifice the last simple belief she has left, that innocence alone is enough to survive conquest. Unfolds as Brenia begins to understand that what surrounds her is not chaos, but a system colder than battle, a machine built long before her capture and refined through countless conquered peoples. And this realization is more terrifying than random cruelty, because systems do not feel guilt. From whispered conversations between guards and fragments overheard through canvas walls, she pieces together the Roman hierarchy of women, an unspoken ladder where value determines fate, and fate is decided before a name is ever spoken. At the bottom are the many, women whose lives dissolve into numbers, sold in groups, transported, forgotten, their suffering unremarkable because it is common. And above them those with skills, whose hands are worth more than their voices, and higher still the wives of warriors, exotic enough to be desired, yet insignificant enough to be discarded. But at the very top are queens, and Brenia understands with a tightening chest that queens are not meant to disappear quietly, they are meant to be seen. Rome needs symbols as much as it needs gold, and a broken queen is a message written in flesh, proof that no belief, no lineage survives Roman order. This knowledge brings shock, not because she did not imagine brutality, but because she sees how deliberately it is arranged, how humiliation replaces execution, because it lasts longer and travels farther. The past beliefs of her people echo painfully now. The old stories claiming that sacred women were protected by divine law, even in defeat. And she feels the weight of that belief collapse under Roman logic, which recognizes only usefulness. Yet within this crushing understanding, Brenia also senses insecurity beneath Roman authority, because a system so carefully ranked fears unpredictability above all else. Officers argue quietly about who controls which prisoners. Favors are traded, promises made, and she realizes greed is the true engine here. Greed for status, reward, advancement, and recognition from distant Rome. The commander who holds her fate does not merely want obedience. He wants certainty, and certainty requires information only she possesses. This is where fear begins to shift, becoming a weapon instead of a chain, because Brenia knows that Rome's greatest weakness is its confidence that conquered people are finished once disarmed. Curiosity becomes her shield, pushing her to observe rather than despair, to listen rather than react, and she tests the boundaries of her captivity with careful questions, measured compliance, calculated silence. Every rule she learns becomes a potential lever, every expectation a weakness to exploit, and she understands that survival will demand she step outside the moral world she once lived in, abandoning the belief that righteousness alone grants protection. The challenge before her is not merely to endure, but to remain dangerous without appearing defiant, to exist inside the system while quietly undermining it. And as night settles over the camp and the sounds of suffering drift through the dark, Brenia accepts a terrible truth that history rarely admits, that for women like her under empire, survival itself becomes an act that blurs the line between victim and strategist, and the cost of living may be the loss of the person she once believed herself to be. Begins the moment Brenia is summoned back into the commander's tent, and this time she understands the meeting is no longer about dominance, but about uncertainty, because Rome does not summon what it has already broken. The legatus speaks calmly, almost politely, yet beneath his composed tone she senses impatience, the kind that grows when power meets resistance it cannot immediately name. He offers wine, space, clothing, small gestures meant to suggest mercy. But Brenia recognizes them as tools, incentives designed to test how cheaply she can be bought. Fear returns, not sudden or sharp, but steady and suffocating, because every word she speaks may determine whether her sons live or vanish into the machinery she has begun to understand. She challenges him without raising her voice, framing survival as a transaction rather than a plea, and the surprise on his face confirms what she suspected, that Roman authority is accustomed to silence and screaming, not negotiation. In this moment, Brenia abandons another past belief, the idea that dignity must be preserved at all costs, and replaces it with something harsher, the belief that dignity can be postponed if survival demands it. The commander speaks of persuasion, of methods refined through experience, and though he does not describe them, the implication is enough to send a quiet shock through her body. Yet she does not retreat, because retreat would invite exactly what he threatens. Instead, she speaks of unreliable pain, of false truths extracted under suffering, and in doing so, she introduces doubt into a system that depends on obedience producing results. Greed flickers in his eyes when she mentions treasure and hidden knowledge, and Brenia understands that this greed is her narrow path forward, because men who want something badly enough can be guided, delayed, misled. She offers a version of truth, close enough to be believable, distant enough to buy time, and time is now her most precious currency. The commander accepts not because he trusts her, but because curiosity outweighs caution, and curiosity has undone empires as often as arrogance. As she is escorted back to her guarded tent, clothed now, separated from the mass of captives, she recognizes the signal for what it is: temporary value, conditional protection, a pause in the inevitable rather than an escape from it. Insecurity hums beneath the camp's discipline, officers competing, soldiers boasting, information flowing unevenly, and Brenia listens, storing fragments like weapons. She realizes that Rome's greatest strength, its order, is also its vulnerability, because order depends on everyone believing in it, and belief can fracture quietly. The challenge ahead is no longer simply to survive the night, but to manage expectations, to remain useful without becoming consumed, to keep her captors guessing just long enough to alter her children's fate. As darkness falls and the camp settles into uneasy routine, Brenia accepts that she has crossed an invisible line, becoming something her people never prepared her to be, a queen who must lie not for power or glory, but to outlast an empire that believes it has already written her ending. Moves away from Brenia's tent and into the shadows where history itself has been shaped, because what she is trapped inside is not only a Roman camp, but a narrative Rome carefully controls, and this is where the true danger hides. The conquerors will later describe victories, numbers, strategies, and triumphs, but the rituals that follow conquest are rarely written down, passed instead through practice, rumor, and deliberate silence, and Brenia senses that silence pressing in around her like another set of chains. She remembers the teachings of the sacred grove, how knowledge was protected not by secrecy alone, but by fragmentation, by allowing no single voice to carry the whole truth. And she recognizes the same method twisted into Roman use, where no single officer claims responsibility for what happens to captured women, because responsibility dissolves when cruelty is routine. Fear deepens as she understands that the worst acts are not spontaneous, but expected, not punished, but rewarded, woven into the unspoken culture of victory. And this realization shocks her more than violence itself. The past belief that Rome brought order to chaos collapses entirely, replaced by the image of a machine that feeds on humiliation as proof of dominance. And Brenia realizes why later historians avoided these details, because empires prefer to be remembered as builders, not consumers of suffering. She hears fragments through the night stories, half-whispered by guards who assume captives do not understand their language, mentions of triumphs, processions, and the careful selection of who will be displayed and who will vanish. And she understands that queens are dangerous, not because they resist, but because they remind the conquered of once existed. This is why their degradation must be public, symbolic, unforgettable. And Brenia feels the weight of that role settling over her like a sentence not yet spoken. Yet within this darkness, curiosity sharpens her awareness. Because if Rome fears memory, then memory is a weapon, and Brenia carries memories no Ramang can erase without killing her. She begins to see that the system depends on everyone believing there is no alternative, that fate flows in one direction only, and this belief creates obedience faster than any sword. The challenge now is to disrupt belief without appearing to challenge authority, to introduce uncertainty where certainty is required, and Brenia tests this quietly by asking questions framed as ignorance, by observing which answers differ depending on who speaks. Greed continues to ripple through the camp, officers dreaming of advancement, of rewards carried back to Rome, and Brenia understands that greed fractures unity, creating cracks she may yet widen. The shock of her situation hardens into resolve because she sees that history's greatest lie is not that cruelty happened, but that it was inevitable. And as the night stretches on, she accepts that her survival is now tied to something larger than herself, the preservation of truth in a world determined to erase it. When dawn approaches and the camp stirs again, Brenia knows she is no longer merely enduring Roman power. She is watching it closely, searching for the moment when its carefully maintained silence will finally break. Begins when Brenia realizes that the Roman system surrounding her is no longer as stable as it pretends to be, because systems reveal their weakness, not when challenged openly, but when forced to adjust. Days pass, and the search parties sent after her carefully shaped information return frustrated, bringing back uncertainty instead of treasure, and she feels the shift in the air before anyone speaks of it. The commander's confidence tightens into suspicion, and suspicion spreads downward, creating tension among officers who fear blame more than failure. Brenia understands then that Rome's power depends on the illusion of inevitability, the belief that its plans unfold exactly as intended. And once that belief cracks, fear replaces discipline. Greed, once a motivator, becomes corrosive, as men argue over rewards that now seem delayed or threatened, and Brenia listens carefully, learning how ambition turns allies into rivals. She is questioned again, more sharply this time, but she answers with calm consistency, repeating details that sound plausible because they are partially true. And the shock on the commander's face is subtle when he realizes he cannot easily prove her deception. Past belief, the Roman assumption that captives break quickly under pressure, fails here, and that failure unsettles him more than open defiance would have. Brenia senses his insecurity growing, not because he lacks power, but because power without certainty feels suddenly fragile. She begins to notice small changes, guards rotating more often, voices lowered, orders repeated twice, all signs of a system compensating for doubt. And she understands that this is the moment where survival can tilt toward influence. The challenge becomes maintaining her value without triggering punishment, appearing cooperative without surrendering control, and she walks this narrow line with exhausting precision. Fear still exists, but it has changed shape, no longer a threat looming from above, but a pressure shared by everyone in the camp, and shared fear erodes hierarchy. Brenia tests this by offering minor, harmless insights, observations that help the commander feel in control again, and in doing so, she deepens his dependence on her presence. Curiosity works in her favor, now because he wants to understand her mind too, categorize her as he would any conquered resource, and this curiosity blinds him to the possibility that she is shaping outcomes rather than reacting to them. She realizes that the Roman system was never designed to handle captives who think in terms of structure instead of emotion, because it assumes submission follows defeat. As night falls once more, Brenia reflects on the cost of what she is doing, the gradual erosion of the person. She once was the priestess who believed truth was sacred and lies destructive, and she feels the weight of that loss settle heavily within her. Yet she also sees that the system tightening around her is beginning to turn inward, consuming its own certainty, and she understands that while Rome may still decide her fate, it no longer controls every consequence of its decisions. In this fragile imbalance, Brenia holds on to one dangerous truth, that empires do not fall only to armies, but to moments when those they believe broken learn how to move unseen within the machinery itself. Arrives quietly, not with violence or revelation, but with the heavy stillness that follows irreversible choices. And Brenia understands that the moment she has been moving toward is no longer ahead of her, but already unfolding. The commander returns with answers at last, fragments of truth mixed with failure, and in his eyes she sees confirmation that her gamble has worked just enough to change outcomes, but not enough to escape consequence. Her sons will live not free, not remembered as princes, but alive within Roman households where survival is measured in obedience rather than honor, and this knowledge brings relief sharpened by grief, because she understands what kind of lives they will inherit. Fear does not vanish, it settles into something colder, an acceptance that safety under empire is always conditional and can be revoked without explanation. The final negotiation is brief, because there is little left to negotiate, only terms to acknowledge. And Brenia realizes that Rome does not need her destroyed to win. It needs her transformed, stripped of meaning and reassigned purpose until even memory weakens. Past beliefs return one last time, the teachings that claimed endurance was victory and survival sacred, and she feels their weight clash violently with the truth before her that survival often demands surrendering the story you once told yourself about who you are. Shock comes not from cruelty, but from banality, from how easily decisions are finalized, how calmly lives are redirected. And she sees clearly now why history rarely pauses on moments like this, because there is nothing traumatic about quiet erasure. The commander offers a future that looks like mercy from a distance, and Brenia accepts because refusal would be purity without purpose, and purpose is the last thing she has left to protect. Insecurity lingers beneath Roman confidence, however, because even now they watch her carefully, aware that something about her does not fit their categories, and that awareness is her final, fragile leverage. Curiosity remains alive within her too, a restless awareness that history is not only written by victors, but shaped by what survives unnoticed, by lives bent but not entirely broken. The challenge that remains is not resistance but endurance, learning to exist within a role designed to erase her past while quietly preserving fragments of truth that may one day surface. As she is led away from the camp that consumed her world, Brenia looks back not with hatred but with clarity, understanding that Rome's greatest violence was not what it did to bodies, but what it demanded of the living, the slow abandonment of identity in exchange for breath. The final reflection settles heavily as she steps into her new fate as humanity's darkest chapters are rarely defined by monsters alone, but by systems that make survival feel like complicity, and by the impossible choices forced upon those history later pretends never existed.